On a cold Tuesday evening in Manhattan, veteran journalist Victoria Sterling thought she was about to deliver the career-defining moment that would cement her legacy as television's most fearless interrogator. What she didn't know was that in exactly 37 minutes, a single question would unravel everything she had built over 2 decades, and the woman sitting across from her, someone she had dismissed as just another political appointee, would reveal a truth so devastating that it would force an entire industry to confront its own reflection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The newsroom at Channel 7 News buzzed with the electric tension that only comes before a major confrontation. Victoria Sterling adjusted her signature red blazer and checked her reflection in the monitor one final time. At 52, she had perfected the art of the calculated takedown, her sharp blue eyes and silver hair giving her an air of authority that had made politicians sweat for over 20 years. Tonight's target was supposed to be easy prey. Diana Foster sat in the guest chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. At 45, the newly appointed Secretary of Education appeared unassuming in her simple navy dress and understated jewelry. The media had painted her as an inexperienced outsider, someone who had stumbled into power through political connections rather than merit. Victoria had done her homework, or so she thought. Diana Foster had been a small-town school principal. Before her sudden rise to federal prominence, no Ivy League credentials, no prestigious think tank positions, no cable news appearances, just a woman from nowhere who somehow found herself in charge of the nation's educational policy. What Victoria didn't know was that Diana Foster had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this moment in ways that had nothing to do with media training or talking points. She had been making phone calls, not to political strategists, but to people whose names would never appear in Washington Post profiles. Former students, struggling teachers, parents who worked 3 jobs to afford school supplies for their children. Diana had been collecting stories, real stories, the kind that don't fit neatly into cable news segments or political narratives. The red light flickered on, and Victoria Sterling launched into her opening with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. She had perfected this technique over thousands of interviews, establishing dominance early, creating an atmosphere where her guests felt cornered and defensive. Tonight would be no different. Secretary Foster, thank you for joining us tonight. I want to start with something that I think will surprise our viewers. Victoria's voice carried that particular blend of false warmth and barely concealed aggression that had become her trademark. You've been in your position for exactly 6 months, and already there are serious questions about your qualifications. You have no advanced degrees in education policy, no experience managing large organizations, and frankly, no business being in charge of a department that affects 50 million children. How do you respond to critics who say you're simply not qualified for this job? Diana Foster didn't flinch. She'd expected this line of attack, had prepared for it, but not in the way most politicians prepare. She didn't have a team of handlers feeding her carefully crafted responses designed to deflect and pivot. Instead, she had something far more powerful, the truth about who she really was and why she was sitting in that chair. Victoria, I appreciate the question because it gives me a chance to address something that's been weighing on my mind. Diana's voice was steady, almost conversational. You're absolutely right that I don't have the typical credentials that people expect in this role. I don't have a PhD from Harvard or years of experience in Washington think tanks. What I do have is 23 years of walking into classrooms every single day and seeing what actually works and what doesn't. Victoria sensed an opportunity to press harder. This was exactly the kind of defensive response she could exploit. But surely you understand that good intentions aren't enough when you're managing a budget of $78 billion and Policies that affect every school district in America. Don't you think the American people deserve someone with actual expertise in educational leadership? I think the American people deserve someone who understands that expertise isn't just about degrees and credentials. Diana's voice remained calm, but there was something building beneath the surface, a quiet intensity that Victoria didn't recognize as dangerous. Let me tell you about expertise, Victoria. Expertise is knowing that when a child comes to school hungry, they can't learn multiplication tables. Expertise is understanding that a teacher working 2 jobs to pay rent can't give their best effort in the classroom. Expertise is recognizing that standardized test scores don't measure a child's creativity, empathy, or resilience. Victoria felt the interview slipping away from her planned narrative, but she wasn't concerned yet. She had been in this position before, dealing with passionate advocates who confused emotion with substance. She decided to escalate, to push Diana into the kind of defensive posture that would make for compelling television. That's a very touching sentiment, Secretary Foster, but let's talk about results. In your previous position as principal of Lincoln Elementary, your school consistently ranked in the bottom 20% of the state. Test scores were declining, teacher turnover was high, and parent satisfaction surveys showed significant concerns. If you couldn't successfully manage one school, how can you possibly be trusted with the entire educational system of the United States? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Victoria had spent hours researching those statistics, confident they would deliver the knockout blow. She had no idea that she had just triggered something far more powerful than she bargained for. Diana Foster's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the interview began, she smiled. But it wasn't the polite, political smile that viewers were accustomed to seeing from government officials. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting her entire career for this exact moment. I'm glad you brought up Lincoln Elementary, Victoria, because that's where this story really begins. Diana leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a different quality, more personal, more real. You're absolutely correct about those statistics. Lincoln Elementary was indeed ranked in the bottom 20% when I arrived there. It was a failing school in every measurable way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But what those numbers don't tell you is why it was failing, and more importantly, what happened when we stopped measuring success by the same broken standards that created the failure in the first place. Victoria felt the first flutter of unease, but she pressed on. Secretary Foster, with respect, results are results. Numbers don't lie. Your school was failing under your leadership. You're right, Victoria. Numbers don't lie, but they don't always tell the whole truth either. Diana's voice was gaining strength now, not defensively, but with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Lincoln Elementary was 92% minority enrollment, 87% free, and reduced lunch, 43% English language learners. It was located in a neighborhood where the median household income was $18,000 a year. The building was 60 years old with broken heating, leaking roofs, and textbooks from the 1990s. Victoria interrupted, sensing she needed to regain control. But those are just excuses, aren't they? Good leaders find ways to succeed regardless of circumstances. Actually, Victoria, you've just made my point perfectly. Diana's smile broadened, and for the first time, Victoria felt like she was the one being cornered. Good leaders do find ways to succeed, but they also recognize when the definition of success itself is the problem. So let me tell you what we did at Lincoln Elementary, and why those test scores you're so concerned about were actually the least important thing happening in that building. Diana paused, and in that moment of silence, Victoria realized that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the interview. The woman across from her was no longer playing defense. She was taking control of the narrative in a way that Victoria had never experienced in her decades of interviewing. In my first year at Lincoln, I spent more time in the community than I did in the school building. I visited the apartment complex where 60% of our students lived, where families of 5 were crammed into one-bedroom units with no heat in winter. I sat in the emergency room at the county hospital at 2 in the morning with parents who couldn't afford to take their children to a regular doctor. I went to the food bank where our families stood in line for hours to get enough groceries to last 3 days. Victoria tried to interrupt again, but Diana continued without acknowledging her. I learned that Maria Gonzalez, one of our 3rd graders, was responsible for translating all official documents for her family because she was the only one who spoke English fluently. I discovered that 8-year-old Jerome Williams was chronically late to school because he had to walk his little sister to daycare on the other side of town before he could come to class. I found out that our star 5th grade student Angela Chen was doing her homework by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off in her family's apartment. The newsroom, which had been buzzing with the usual background noise of a live broadcast, had gone completely silent. Camera operators found themselves leaning in closer. Production assistants stopped what they were doing to listen, and Victoria Sterling felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years of television journalism. She was completely unprepared for what was happening. So yes, Victoria, our test scores were low because it's hard to focus on reading comprehension when you're hungry. It's difficult to show improvement in mathematics when you're worried about whether your family will have a place to sleep next week. It's nearly impossible to demonstrate growth in any standardized measure when the very concept of standardization ignores the reality of your existence. Diana's voice had taken on a rhythm now, not the practiced cadence of a politician, but the natural flow of someone telling a story they had lived. Victoria found herself genuinely listening for the first time in years, not strategizing her next question or planning her attack, but actually hearing the words being spoken. So we changed everything, Victoria. We stopped measuring ourselves by standards created by people who had never set foot in our neighborhood. We started measuring success by different metrics, like the number of families we helped connect with social services, like the percentage of students who felt safe and supported at school, like the community partnerships we built with local organizations, like the number of teachers who chose to stay year after year because they believed in what we were doing. Victoria felt the interview spinning completely out of her control, but for some reason, she found herself unable to stop it. There was something hypnotic about Diana's storytelling, something that transcended the usual political theater of cable news. We turned our school into a community center. We offered adult English classes for parents in the evenings. We partnered with the local health clinic to provide basic medical care for students and families. We started a weekend food program that sent groceries home with students on Fridays. We created after-school programs that weren't just homework, help, but real opportunities for students to explore art, music, coding, and entrepreneurship. Diana paused again. And in that silence, Victoria realized that everyone in the studio was hanging on every word. This wasn't the kind of interview that cable news was built for. There were no sound bites, no gotcha moments, no viral clips waiting to be extracted. This was something else entirely. And you know what happened, Victoria? Something that your statistics can't measure. Our students started to thrive. Not because their test scores improved, though they eventually did, but because they started to believe in themselves, because they felt seen and valued for who they were, not punished for what they lacked. Because we created a place where their families felt welcome and supported, not judged and excluded. Victoria felt compelled to ask a question, though she wasn't sure why. But surely you understand that in a system as large as the Department of Education, you can't run every school like a community center. There have to be standards, accountability measures, ways to ensure taxpayer dollars are being used effectively. You're absolutely right, Victoria. And that's exactly why I'm sitting here tonight. Diana's eyes lit up with an intensity that made Victoria suddenly understand that she was no longer conducting an interview. She was witnessing something far more significant. Because what we learned at Lincoln Elementary wasn't just about one school in one neighborhood. It was about fundamental principles that can transform education everywhere, if we have the courage to implement them. Diana leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since the interview began, she looked directly into the camera instead of at Victoria. When she spoke, it was as if she was talking to every viewer individually, not delivering a political message, but sharing a personal conviction. Every child in America, regardless of their zip code, their family's income, or the language they speak at home, deserves an education that sees them as a whole human being, not a test score, not a data point, not a statistic to be improved or explained away. A human being with dreams, talents, challenges, and unlimited potential. Victoria found herself nodding along, which was something that had never happened to her during an interview. She was supposed to be the skeptical interrogator, the voice of hard-nosed journalism holding power accountable. But something about Diana's presence, her authenticity, her complete absence of political calculation, was dissolving all of Victoria's professional defenses. At Lincoln Elementary, we proved that when you treat children and families with dignity and respect, when you address their real needs instead of imposing artificial standards, when you build genuine partnerships with communities instead of dictating to them from above, extraordinary things happen. Our students didn't just improve academically. They became confident, creative, compassionate young people who believed they could change the world. Diana paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. And many of them have, Victoria. Maria Gonzalez, the little girl who was translating documents for her family in 3rd grade, just graduated from MIT with a degree in computer science. Jerome Williams, who used to be late because he was taking care of his sister, is now a pediatric nurse who volunteers at a free clinic in his old neighborhood. Angela Chen, who did her homework by candlelight, is currently completing her PhD in education policy and has developed innovative programs that are being implemented in schools across 3 states. Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced. In decades of journalism, she was genuinely moved, not strategically, not professionally, but personally. The armor of cynicism that had protected her throughout her career was dissolving, and she found herself seeing Diana Foster not as a political target, but as a human being with a profound understanding of something that Victoria had forgotten existed in Washington: authentic purpose. But those are just individual success stories, Victoria said, though her voice lacked its earlier edge. How do you scale that kind of personal attention across millions of students? That's the beautiful thing, Victoria. You don't scale personal attention. You scale the principles that make personal attention possible. Diana's voice took on an almost musical quality, the rhythm of someone who had spent years refining not just her ideas, but her ability to communicate them with clarity and passion. You scale respect by training every educator to see each student as an individual with unique strengths and challenges. You scale dignity by designing policies that support families instead of judging them. You scale community by creating systems that bring schools and neighborhoods together in genuine partnership. You scale hope by ensuring that every child has access to the resources they need to succeed, not just the resources we think they deserve based on arbitrary measures. Victoria realized that she had stopped thinking about television ratings, social media engagement, or her own professional reputation. For the first time in years, she was simply present in a conversation, listening to someone speak truth with such clarity that it felt revolutionary. Secretary Foster, I have to admit, when you walked into this studio tonight, I expected a very different conversation. I came prepared to challenge your qualifications, to ask tough questions about your record, to hold you accountable for taking on a role that many people believe you weren't prepared for. And you should have, Victoria. Those are exactly the right questions to ask. Diana's response surprised Victoria with its generosity. The American people deserve to know who is making decisions about their children's education and why. They deserve to understand not just what policies are being implemented, but what values are driving those policies. They deserve transparency and accountability from everyone in positions of public trust. Victoria felt a strange sensation, something she couldn't immediately identify. It took her a moment to realize what it was. Respect. Not the professional courtesy that characterized most political interviews, but genuine respect for someone who was approaching public service from a place of authentic commitment rather than personal ambition. But I also want them to understand something that doesn't always come through in these kinds of conversations, Diana continued. I didn't seek this position because I thought I had all the answers. I accepted it because I've seen what's possible when we stop pretending that the current system is working for everyone and start building something better. Diana's voice took on a more personal tone, and Victoria found herself leaning forward. No longer as an interrogator, but as someone genuinely curious about what she was going to hear next. 3 months ago, I received a letter from a teacher in rural Oklahoma. She told me about a student in her class, a boy named David, who was brilliant but struggled with traditional testing because of a learning disability. Under our current system, David was labeled as failing, placed in remedial classes, and essentially written off by the age of 10. But this teacher saw something different. She worked with David's family to develop alternative ways for him to demonstrate his knowledge. She connected him with mentors who understood his learning style. She advocated for accommodations that allowed him to show what he really knew. Victoria found herself completely absorbed in the story, no longer thinking about interview techniques or television pacing. David is now 14 years old, and he just published his first research paper on sustainable agriculture in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Not because he got better at taking tests, but because someone believed in him enough to find a different way to measure his intelligence and support his growth. Diana looked directly at Victoria, and in her eyes was the intensity that transcended politics or policy. That's what I want for every child in America, Victoria, not just the ones who happen to fit neatly into our current definitions of success, but every single child. The ones who learn differently, who come from difficult circumstances, who speak different languages, who have been told they're not smart enough or not worth the investment. I want every child to have at least one adult who sees their potential and refuses to give up on them. Victoria felt tears forming in her eyes, which was something that had never happened to her during a television interview. She was a professional, trained to maintain emotional distance, to ask hard questions, without being swayed by personal appeals. But there was something about Diana's complete sincerity, her obvious passion for the work she was doing, that was breaking through every professional barrier Victoria had constructed over 2 decades of career advancement. How do you respond to critics who say that kind of individualized attention is unrealistic in a system as large and bureaucratic as public education? Victoria asked, though she was no longer sure why she was asking it. I tell them they're absolutely right. Diana said with a laugh that was both genuine and slightly mischievous. It is completely unrealistic to expect individualized attention in a system designed for mass processing, which is why we have to change the system. Diana's voice took on a new energy, and Victoria realized that she was witnessing something rare, a politician who was actually excited about policy details. We're piloting programs in 12 states that give teachers and principals unprecedented flexibility in how they assess student progress. Instead of relying solely on standardized tests, they can use portfolios, projects, presentations, community service, internships, and dozens of other methods to demonstrate learning. We're training educators to recognize different types of intelligence and learning styles. We're providing resources for schools to partner with local organizations, businesses, and community groups to create real-world learning opportunities. Victoria found herself asking follow-up questions, not because she was trying to trap Diana or create controversy, but because she was genuinely interested in the answers. But how do you ensure consistency across different schools and districts? How do you maintain standards while allowing for so much variation? That's the wrong question, Victoria, and I say that with respect. Diana's response was gentle, but firm. The right question is, how do we ensure that every child receives an education that prepares them to succeed in the world they're actually going to live in? How do we maintain high expectations while recognizing that children are not identical products to be manufactured according to a single specification? Diana paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of years of experience. In classrooms with real children facing real challenges, consistency in education shouldn't mean that every child gets exactly the same instruction delivered in exactly the same way. It should mean that every child gets what they need to reach their full potential. Standards shouldn't be about forcing everyone into the same mold. They should be about ensuring that no child is left behind, ignored, or written off because they don't fit our narrow definitions of success. Victoria realized that the interview had been going on for nearly 40 minutes, which was unprecedented for her show. Normally, she would have wrapped up after 20 minutes, leaving time for commercial breaks and other segments. But something about this conversation felt too important to interrupt, too genuine to sacrifice for the sake of television pacing. Secretary Foster, I have to ask you something that might seem unusual, but I think our viewers deserve to hear your answer. Victoria's voice had lost all traces of its earlier aggression and had taken on a tone of genuine curiosity. Why are you really doing this? You could have stayed at Lincoln Elementary, continued making a difference in the lives of students and families you knew personally. Why take on the enormous challenge of trying to change education policy at the federal level? Diana was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see that she was considering not just how to answer the question, but whether to reveal something deeply personal. Because I made a promise, Victoria, not to a political party or a special interest group or even to the president who appointed me. I made a promise to a little girl named Sarah. Diana's voice became very soft, and Victoria found herself holding her breath. Sarah was in my second grade class during my first year of teaching 24 years ago. She was 7 years old, brilliant, curious, full of questions about everything. She loved science, especially astronomy. She would stay after school to look at pictures of planets and stars in old National Geographic magazines. She told me she wanted to be an astronaut when she grew up. Victoria sensed that this story was going to be difficult to hear, but she also knew it was important. Sarah's family moved around a lot because her father was looking for work. She attended 6 different schools between 2nd and 5th grade. Each time she moved, she had to adjust to new curricula, new expectations, new ways of measuring her progress. She fell further and further behind, not because she wasn't smart, but because the system couldn't accommodate a child whose education had been disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. Diana's voice remained steady, but Victoria could see the pain in her eyes. By middle school, Sarah had been labeled as a slow learner. By high school, she was placed in remedial classes. She stopped talking about astronomy, stopped asking questions about science, stopped believing that she was capable of achieving her dreams. She graduated with a diploma that didn't reflect her intelligence or her potential, and she never had the opportunity to pursue higher education. Victoria felt a deep sadness settling over the studio, not just for Sarah, but for all the Sarahs who had been failed by systems that were supposed to support them. I lost touch with Sarah after she moved away from our district, but I never forgot her. And I never stopped thinking about what might have been different if we had a system that supported children like her instead of punishing them for circumstances they couldn't control. Diana looked directly into the camera again, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. 5 years ago, I found Sarah. She was working 3 part-time jobs, struggling to support her 2 children as a single mother. She told me that she still loved science, still looked up at the stars sometimes, and wondered what it would have been like to study them. But she also told me that she never believed it was possible for someone like her. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in her career, she didn't care that she was crying on television. I promised Sarah that I would do everything in my power to make sure that no other child would be robbed of their dreams by a system that measured their worth by their circumstances instead of their potential. That promise is why I became a principal. It's why I spent 20 years fighting for students who everyone else had given up on. And it's why I accepted this position, even though I knew people would question my qualifications. Diana's voice grew stronger, more resolute. I may not have a PhD in education policy, Victoria, but I have something that no amount of academic credentials can provide. I have walked into classrooms every day for over 2 decades and seen the faces of children who deserve better than what we're currently offering them. I have held the hands of parents who love their children but don't know how to navigate systems that seem designed to exclude them. I have worked with teachers who entered the profession to make a difference but find themselves trapped in bureaucracies that value compliance over creativity. Victoria found herself nodding, no longer as a journalist seeking quotable material, but as a human being recognizing truth when she heard it. And I have met hundreds of Sarahs, Victoria, children whose brilliance was overlooked because it didn't fit standard measurements, children whose potential was dismissed because their families didn't have the resources to advocate for them, children who were told they weren't college material, weren't leadership material, weren't worth the extra investment of time and attention. Diana leaned forward, and her voice took on an urgency that filled the entire studio. But I've also seen what happens when we refuse to accept those limitations. I've seen children achieve things that their test scores said were impossible. I've seen families become partners in their children's education when they're treated with respect instead of judgment. I've seen communities transform when schools become centers of hope instead of sorting mechanisms for social class. Victoria realized that she had completely abandoned her prepared questions, her planned lines of attack, her professional persona. She was simply listening to someone speak with more authenticity than she had heard in years of political interviews. That's what I want to build on a national scale, Victoria, not a perfect system, because no system can be perfect, but a better system, a more human system, a system that sees every child as a whole person with unlimited potential, regardless of their starting point. Diana paused, and when she continued, her voice carried both determination and humility. I know I don't have all the answers, I know that changing education policy at the federal level is exponentially more complex than running a single elementary school. I know that there will be obstacles, setbacks, and critics who believe I'm not qualified for this role. Victoria found herself wanting to defend Diana against those critics, which was a completely foreign impulse for someone who had built her career on being the critic. But I also know that the status quo is unacceptable. I know that we are failing millions of children every year, not because they aren't capable of learning, but because we aren't capable of teaching them in ways that honor their individual strengths and address their individual needs. I know that we have the knowledge, the resources, and the moral obligation to do better. Diana looked directly at Victoria, and in her gaze was something that Victoria had rarely encountered in Washington: genuine hope backed by practical experience. So yes, I am going to use this position to advocate for policies that prioritize children over politics, families over bureaucracy, learning over testing, and humanity over efficiency. I'm going to work with educators, parents, and community leaders to build systems that serve all children, not just the ones who are easy to educate. And I am going to do everything in my power to ensure that the next Sarah I meet will have every opportunity to reach for the stars, literally and figuratively. Victoria sat in stunned silence for several seconds, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she suddenly understood that everything she thought she knew about her role as a journalist had just been challenged in the most fundamental way possible. "Secretary Foster," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." Diana looked genuinely surprised. "Victoria, you don't owe me anything. You asked exactly the questions you should have asked." "No," Victoria said, shaking her head. "I came into this interview with preconceived notions about who you were and what you represented. I was prepared to tear you down, to expose you as unqualified, to create compelling television by putting you on the defensive. I wasn't prepared to actually listen to what you had to say." Victoria felt something shifting inside her, something that had been locked away for years behind professional cynicism and career ambition. "But more than that, I realized that I've been doing this job wrong for a very long time. I've been so focused on creating conflict, on finding gotcha moments, on generating controversy, that I've forgotten what journalism is supposed to be about: seeking truth, telling important stories, and helping people understand complex issues that affect their lives." Diana smiled, and it was the same genuine, warm smile that had comforted thousands of students and parents over the years. "Victoria, you've been doing exactly what the system rewards. You've been successful according to the metrics that matter in television journalism. But just like in education, maybe it's time to question whether those metrics are actually measuring what's most important." Victoria felt a profound sense of recognition, as if Diana had just articulated something that had been troubling her for years without her being able to name it. "You know what the strangest part of this conversation has been for me?" Victoria asked, though she wasn't sure where the question was coming from. "What's that?" "For the first time in probably a decade, I haven't thought once about ratings, or social media engagement, or whether this interview will go viral. I haven't been calculating how to create sound bites or looking for moments that will generate controversy. I've just been listening to you talk about work that you clearly love, about children you've dedicated your life to serving, about changes you believe need to be made for reasons that have nothing to do with politics or personal advancement." Victoria paused, struggling to articulate something that felt both obvious and revolutionary. "And I realized that's what journalism used to feel like for me before I got caught up in the game of it all. Before I started measuring my success by how effectively I could dismantle people rather than how well I could help audiences understand important issues." Diana nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you and I have had similar journeys, just in different fields." I think most people who go into education or journalism do it because they want to make a positive difference in the world. But both professions have systems that can pull you away from that original purpose if you're not careful. Victoria. You felt tears in her eyes again, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of relief she hadn't expected. Secretary Foster, can I ask you one more question, and can it be completely off the record? Diana laughed. Victoria, we're on live television. Nothing about this conversation has been off the record. Victoria laughed too, and realized it was the first time she had laughed during an interview in years. You're right, but what I want to ask is personal, not professional. How do you maintain hope? How do you keep believing that change is possible when you're working within systems that seem designed to resist change? How do you keep faith in people's ability to do better when you've seen so much evidence of failure and indifference? Diana was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could see that she was considering the question seriously. I think hope isn't something you maintain, Victoria. Hope is something you create through action. Every time I see a child learn something new, every time I watch a teacher find a creative way to reach a struggling student, every time I meet a parent who refuses to give up on their child's education, I'm witnessing hope being created in real time. Diana's voice took on the quality of someone sharing a hard-won wisdom. Hope isn't naive optimism about the future. Hope is the daily choice to believe that your actions matter, that small changes can lead to big transformations, that individual human beings have the power to make life better for other individual human beings. Victoria found herself taking notes, not for television, but for herself. And faith in people's ability to do better comes from actually seeing people do better when they're given the support, resources, and respect they need to succeed. It comes from understanding that most failures aren't personal failures, they're system failures. When you change the systems, you often discover that people are capable of much more than anyone imagined. Diana looked around the studio, taking in the cameras, the lights, the producers and technicians who had been listening intently to the entire conversation. Including journalists, Victoria. Including television producers and network executives and media critics. Everyone in this industry got into it for reasons that probably had something to do with truth-telling, storytelling, and public service. But they're working within systems that reward other things. What if we changed those systems? What if we created incentives for journalism that prioritize depth over speed, understanding over controversy, long-term impact over short-term engagement? Victoria felt something click into place, a sense of clarity about her own work that had been missing for years. You know what, Secretary Foster? I think this conversation has just changed how I want to approach my job, not just this interview, but everything I do going forward. How so? I want to start using this platform to tell stories that matter, not just stories that generate ratings. I want to interview people who are doing important work, not just people who are famous or controversial. I want to help audiences understand complex issues, not just consume entertaining content. Victoria paused, feeling both excited and uncertain about what she was committing to. I don't know if my network will support that kind of approach. I don't know if audiences will respond to it. But I know that what we've done here tonight feels more important than anything I've done in years. Diana smiled. That sounds like exactly the kind of systemic change that starts with individual choice. And who knows? Maybe your approach will inspire other journalists to make similar choices. Maybe networks will discover that audiences are hungry for substance, not just spectacle. Maybe the industry will remember that its highest purpose is serving the public good, not just generating profit. Victoria felt a surge of energy that reminded her of why she had wanted to become a journalist in the first place. Secretary Foster, I have one final question, and this one is definitely for our viewers. Of course, what can people do? Parents, teachers, community members, citizens who care about education but feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the challenges. What can they do to be part of the solution you're trying to build? Diana's face lit up with the same enthusiasm Victoria had seen when she talked about individual students. The most important thing people can do is get involved in their local schools and communities, attend school board meetings, volunteer in classrooms, mentor students who need additional support, advocate for policies that prioritize children's well-being over test scores. Diana's voice grew more animated as she continued. But beyond that, I want people to change how they think about education. Stop asking children, "What did you learn in school today?" and start asking, "What questions did you explore today?" Stop measuring your children's worth by their grades and start celebrating their curiosity, creativity, and kindness. Stop accepting that some children are destined to fail and start demanding that all children have access to excellent education. Victoria found herself wishing the interview could continue for hours. And most importantly, Diana continued, I want people to remember that every adult was once a child in a classroom somewhere. We all have a stake in making sure that every child receives the kind of education that helps them become thoughtful, compassionate, capable human beings. Victoria Sterling walked out of the Channel 7 news studio that night, feeling like she was inhabiting someone else's body. The fluorescent lights in the parking garage cast everything in harsh shadows, but somehow the world looked different than it had 3 hours earlier. She sat in her BMW for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened to her carefully constructed professional identity. The interview with Diana Foster was supposed to have been a routine takedown, the kind of calculated confrontation that had made Victoria's reputation as television's most fearless interrogator. Instead, it had become something unprecedented in her 2 decades of broadcast journalism, a genuine conversation about purpose, authenticity, and the courage to challenge systems that had forgotten their original mission. Victoria's phone had been buzzing constantly since they went off the air. Text messages from colleagues, missed calls from her agent, notifications from social media platforms where clips of the interview were already being shared thousands of times. But for the first time in her career, Victoria felt no urgency to check the response, no anxiety about ratings or reviews. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what success actually meant. The drive to her Manhattan apartment usually took 40 minutes, but Victoria found herself taking side streets, unconsciously prolonging the journey. She needed time to think, time to understand why a conversation about education policy had left her feeling like she was rediscovering her own professional purpose after years of sleepwalking through increasingly hollow victories. When she finally reached her building, Victoria bypassed the elevator and walked up 14 flights of stairs, needing the physical exertion to match the mental and emotional work she was trying to process. Her apartment, normally a sanctuary of carefully curated minimalism, felt strangely unfamiliar. The awards lining her bookshelf, the framed magazine covers featuring her photograph, the signed letters from politicians and celebrities all seemed to belong to someone else. Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window overlooking Central Park. The city sparkled below her, millions of lights representing millions of individual lives, each carrying their own stories of struggle and hope and dreams deferred or achieved. For the first time in years, she found herself thinking about those individual lives rather than how they might be aggregated into demographic categories for television programming. Her laptop sat on the coffee table, closed, waiting for her to begin the ritual of post-interview analysis that had become automatic over the years. Victoria would typically spend hours reviewing footage, identifying the most compelling moments, crafting social media posts to maximize engagement, and preparing for the inevitable follow-up interviews about her interview. But tonight, she couldn't bring herself to open the computer. Instead, she found herself thinking about Diana Foster's stories. The children at Lincoln Elementary who had been written off by standardized measures, but flourished when someone took the time to understand their individual circumstances. Sarah, the little girl who loved astronomy but was gradually convinced by systemic failures that her dreams were unrealistic. Maria Gonzalez, who translated documents for her family at age 8 and went on to graduate from MIT. Jerome Williams, who was chronically late because he was caring for his sister and became a pediatric nurse. These weren't political talking points or carefully crafted anecdotes designed to manipulate emotional responses. They were real people whose lives had been shaped by policy decisions made by individuals who would never meet them, never know their names, never understand the ripple effects of bureaucratic choices on human potential. Victoria realized that somewhere in her climb toward professional success, she had stopped seeing the people behind the political positions she was paid to dissect. Politicians, policymakers, and public figures had become chess pieces in an elaborate game of intellectual combat, valued not for their ideas or their impact on actual human lives, but for their ability to provide entertaining content for her audience. The thought was deeply unsettling. Victoria had entered journalism with genuine idealism about the role of media in a democratic society. She believed in the importance of holding powerful people accountable, of investigating complex issues, of helping citizens make informed decisions about their communities and their country. But somewhere along the way, accountability had become ambush journalism, investigation had become gotcha moments, and civic education had become political entertainment. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her introspection. The caller ID showed her producer, Marcus Chen, who had been with Channel 7 for nearly as long as Victoria herself. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but Marcus was not just a colleague, but one of her closest friends, someone who had supported her through every major career transition and personal crisis of the past 15 years. "Marcus," she answered, trying to inject some energy into her voice. "Victoria, what the hell happened in there tonight?" Marcus's voice carried a mixture of concern and confusion that Victoria had never heard before. "I've been producing television for 22 years, and I have never seen anything like what I witnessed tonight. You completely abandoned your interview strategy. You let a guest control the narrative for over an hour, and you ended up crying on camera. Are you okay?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know how to answer, but because she was trying to find words for something she was still trying to understand herself. "Marcus, I think I'm more okay than I've been in years, but I also think everything I thought I knew about my job might be wrong." "What do you mean?" "I mean that interview felt more important, more real, more connected to actual human experience than anything I've done since I started this show. Diana Foster wasn't playing the political game we're all used to. She was talking about work that actually matters, about children whose lives are affected by the policies we treat as abstract debate topics. And listening to her made me realize how disconnected I've become from why I wanted to be a journalist in the first place." Marcus was silent on the other end of the line, and Victoria could practically hear him processing this unexpected philosophical turn from someone who had built her brand on aggressive pragmatism. "Victoria, I understand that the conversation was moving, but we have to think about the bigger picture here. The network executives are already asking questions. Social media is going crazy. Some people are calling it the most authentic political interview they've ever seen, but others are saying you lost control and let a government official use your platform for unchallenged propaganda." Victoria felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the anxiety that had accompanied every bold choice throughout her career. But this time, the anxiety was different. Instead of fear about professional consequences, it was anticipation about what those consequences might reveal about her true priorities. Marcus, can I ask you something? And can you give me an honest answer, not a strategic one? Of course. When you watched that interview tonight, what did you feel? Not as a producer thinking about ratings and network politics, but as a human, listening to someone talk about work they believe in? Marcus was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than Victoria had heard it in years. I felt like I was remembering why I got into television in the first place. Diana Foster reminded me that media can be a force for genuine public service, not just profit generation. She made me think about stories I've wanted to tell, but haven't pursued because they don't fit our current programming model. Victoria felt a surge of relief. If Marcus, one of the most commercially minded people she knew, had been affected by the conversation, maybe her instincts about its importance weren't completely naive. What if we're both right, Marcus? What if tonight was simultaneously a violation of traditional interview protocols and exactly the kind of journalism our country needs right now? What if the reason people are responding so strongly is because they're hungry for authenticity in political discourse? Marcus sighed, and Victoria could hear him shifting into his problem-solving mode. Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say audiences want more substance and less spectacle. How do we convince network executives who measure success by advertising revenue and social media metrics? How do we change a system that rewards controversy over depth? I don't know, Victoria admitted, but I know that I can't go back to conducting interviews the way I did them before tonight. I can't pretend that creating conflict for entertainment value is the same thing as serving the public interest. I can't treat human beings like content to be consumed rather than people with important things to say. Victoria stood and walked to her bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of journalism textbooks she hadn't opened in years. Books about ethics, about the responsibility of media in democratic societies, about the power of storytelling, to create understanding across difference. Marcus, what if we pitched a new kind of show? Something that prioritizes long-form conversations with people who are doing important work, regardless of whether they're famous or controversial. Something that assumes audiences are intelligent and interested in complex issues, rather than just sound bites and gotcha moments. The network would never approve something like that, Marcus said, though Victoria could hear interest creeping into his voice. It goes against everything that drives ratings in cable news. Maybe, Victoria said, but maybe not. What if we're underestimating our audience? What if people are tired of political theater and ready for actual substance? What if tonight's response suggests there's an appetite for the kind of journalism we used to believe in? Victoria moved to her laptop and finally opened it, not to analyze her performance or manage her image, but to research something entirely different. She began searching for information about media organizations that prioritized public service over profit, journalists who had left traditional television to pursue more meaningful work, alternative platforms that supported long-form, in-depth reporting. Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. Okay. I think tonight's interview was the most important work I've done in my entire career. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because it reminded me that journalism can be about connection and understanding, rather than just conflict and entertainment. Because it showed me what's possible when you approach people with genuine curiosity, rather than predetermined narratives. Victoria paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. And I think I want to build my entire professional approach around that kind of work, even if it means risking the career I've spent 20 years building. Marcus was quiet, for so long that Victoria wondered if the call had been dropped. "Marcus, are you still there?" "I'm here. I'm just thinking about what you said, and about what I observed tonight, and about whether I have the courage to follow my instincts the way you're talking about following yours." "What do you mean?" "I mean that watching you rediscover your purpose tonight made me realize how far I've drifted from mine. I became a television producer because I believed in the power of media to educate and inspire people. But I've spent the last decade focusing on audience retention and advertiser satisfaction instead of content quality and public service." Victoria felt a surge of excitement, not about career opportunities, but about the possibility of meaningful collaboration with someone who shared her renewed sense of purpose. "Marcus, what if we did this together? What if we developed a proposal for programming that serves audiences rather than just attracting them? What if we tried to prove that people are more interested in authentic content than we've been giving them credit for?" "It would be risky," Marcus said. "We'd be betting our careers on the assumption that networks are ready to prioritize public service over pure profit. We'd be challenging an entire industry built around the idea that audiences have short attention spans and prefer entertainment to education." "But what if we're right?" Victoria asked. "What if tonight was just the beginning of something larger? What if audiences are ready for media that treats them like citizens rather than consumers?" Victoria walked back to the window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the millions of individual stories that were unfolding in apartments and houses across the metropolitan area. Parents trying to navigate school systems that didn't serve their children well. Teachers working multiple jobs because education wasn't funded adequately. Students whose potential was being overlooked because their talents didn't align with standardized measurements. These were the stories that mattered, the human experiences that should be driving policy discussions rather than political calculations. These were the conversations that journalism should be facilitating, the connections between individual experience and systemic change that media was uniquely positioned to illuminate. "Marcus, I want to try something. I want to spend the next month conducting interviews the way I did tonight, not with the goal of creating viral moments or generating controversy, but with the goal of understanding complex issues through the experiences of people who are directly affected by them." "That sounds like a documentary series, not a cable news show." "Maybe that's exactly what we need to be producing," Victoria said. "Maybe the distinction between news and documentary is artificial. Maybe every important story deserves more than 5-minute segments and soundbite analysis." Victoria could hear Marcus typing in the background, and she wondered if he was taking notes or researching something related to their conversation. "Victoria, I'm looking at the social media response to tonight's interview, and it's unlike anything I've seen in my career. The engagement is massive, but more importantly, the quality of the comments is completely different from typical political content. People are sharing personal stories, having substantive discussions about education policy, thanking you for conducting a respectful conversation with someone they disagreed with politically." Victoria felt her heart rate increase, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. "What does that tell you?" "It tells me that maybe we've been wrong about what audiences want. Maybe people are capable of engaging with complex issues when they're presented thoughtfully. Maybe there's a market for the kind of journalism you're talking about pursuing." Victoria opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. Not a post-interview analysis or a social media strategy, but a proposal for a new kind of programming. Something that would treat every guest as a complete human being with valuable perspectives, regardless of their political affiliation or celebrity status. Something that would prioritize understanding over entertainment, depth over speed, long-term impact over short-term engagement. "Marcus, I'm going to write a proposal for the kind of show I wish existed. Something that assumes audiences are intelligent and curious. Something that serves the public interest rather than just commercial interests. Will you help me develop it? Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. But I think we should also consider whether traditional network television is the right platform for what you're envisioning. There might be better ways to reach audiences who are hungry for authentic content. Victoria spent the next 3 hours writing, fueled by a creative energy she hadn't experienced in years. The proposal that emerged was unlike anything she had ever developed professionally. Instead of focusing on ratings potential and demographic appeal, she found herself articulating a vision for journalism that served democratic ideals and human dignity. The show she envisioned would feature hour-long conversations with people whose work had genuine impact on their communities. Not just politicians and celebrities, but teachers, social workers, small business owners, community organizers, scientists, artists, and activists. People who were solving problems, creating opportunities, and building connections across difference. Each episode would explore a single issue through multiple perspectives, always centering the experiences of people who were directly affected by policies and systems under discussion. The format would allow for nuance, complexity, and genuine dialogue rather than the polarized debates that had come to dominate political media. Most importantly, the show would be explicitly committed to treating every guest with respect and curiosity, regardless of their political views or public reputation. The goal would be understanding, not gotcha moments, connection, not conflict, solutions, not just problems. Victoria finished writing just as the sun was beginning to rise over Manhattan. She had never felt more uncertain about her professional future or more confident about her professional purpose. The proposal might be rejected by every network executive who read it. It might be too radical a departure from proven formulas for commercial success. But it was authentic to her values and responsive to what she had learned about audience appetite for meaningful content. She saved the document and sent a copy to Marcus, along with a message that she hoped captured the mix of excitement and trepidation she was feeling. Marcus, I think I've written something that might change both of our careers, one way or another. It's either the most important work I've ever done or professional suicide disguised as idealism. Maybe both. But I know that after tonight, I can't pretend that creating entertaining conflict is the same thing as serving the public good. I'd rather fail at something meaningful than succeed at something hollow. Victoria closed her laptop and walked to her bedroom, exhausted but more energized than she had felt in years. She had no idea what response her proposal would receive, no certainty about whether her career could survive such a dramatic shift in approach, no guarantee that audiences were actually ready for the kind of journalism she wanted to produce. But she knew that Diana Foster had reminded her of something essential about her profession and her purpose. Journalism at its best was about service, not celebrity. Truth-telling, not entertainment. Connection, not division. And if she was going to continue calling herself a journalist, she needed to align her work with those principles, regardless of the professional risks involved. As Victoria finally fell asleep, she was already planning her next interview. Not with a politician or a celebrity, but with a teacher she had read about who was developing innovative approaches to supporting students with learning disabilities. Someone whose work mattered more than their fame, whose ideas mattered more than their ability to generate controversy, whose commitment to service mattered more than their social media following. For the first time in years, Victoria Sterling was excited about being a journalist. The response to Victoria's proposal came faster than she had expected, but not from the direction she had anticipated. Marcus called her at 7 in the morning, 3 hours after she had finally gone to sleep, with news that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Victoria, you need to see this." The interview has been shared over 2 million times across all platforms. But more importantly, we're getting calls from journalism schools, non-profit organizations, and independent media companies. People want to know if you're serious about developing this kind of programming. Victoria sat up in bed, still processing the information through the fog of insufficient sleep. What kind of calls? The Dean of the Columbia Journalism School wants to discuss a partnership for training young journalists in the approach you demonstrated last night. A foundation that supports public interest media wants to explore funding for the kind of show you proposed. 3 different podcast networks have reached out about developing long-form interview content. And most interesting of all, PBS has expressed interest in exploring whether your vision could work for public television. Victoria felt a mixture of excitement and overwhelm. She had expected resistance, skepticism, maybe even ridicule for proposing such a dramatic departure from commercial television norms. She hadn't expected enthusiasm, support, and concrete opportunities for implementation. Marcus, this is moving really fast. Part of me is excited about the possibilities, but part of me is terrified that I'm about to blow up a successful career based on one good interview and some idealistic proposals. Victoria, can I tell you something that might help you think about this differently? Please. Last night wasn't just one good interview. It was a demonstration of something that's been missing from political media for years. Genuine curiosity about how policy affects real people's lives. You didn't just interview Diana Foster. You modeled a completely different approach to public discourse, one that prioritizes understanding over winning, collaboration over confrontation. Marcus paused, and Victoria could hear him moving around, probably pacing in his apartment the way he did when he was working through complex problems. The reason people are responding so strongly isn't because you were nice to a government official. It's because you demonstrated that political conversations can be substantive, respectful, and genuinely informative. You showed audiences what they've been missing without realizing it. Victoria got up and walked to her kitchen, needing coffee, to help her process the implications of what Marcus was telling her. But what about the network? What about my contract? What about the show I've been hosting for 8 years? That's the other thing I need to tell you, Marcus said, and Victoria could hear a shift in his tone that suggested challenging news was coming. I got a call from the network president an hour ago. The response to last night's interview has been unprecedented, but it's also created some internal tensions. Victoria felt her stomach drop. What kind of tensions? The executives are split. Half of them see last night as proof that audiences are hungry for more substantial content and want to build programming around that insight. The other half see it as a dangerous departure from the formula that's made your show profitable for nearly a decade. Victoria poured coffee with hands that were starting to shake slightly, not from caffeine withdrawal, but from the realization that her career was about to change dramatically, regardless of what she decided to do next. What does that mean practically? It means you have some choices to make, and you need to make them quickly. The network is willing to give you creative control to develop the kind of programming you outlined in your proposal, but it would mean leaving primetime cable television for a different kind of platform. Or you can continue with your current show, but with the understanding that last night was an anomaly, not a new direction. Victoria sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the city skyline and trying to process the magnitude of the decision she was facing. Everything she had worked for over 2 decades had led to this moment of choice between security and authenticity, commercial success and meaningful work, career advancement and professional purpose. Marcus, if I choose to pursue the new direction, what would that actually look like? Not theoretically, but practically. Based on the conversations I've had this morning, it would look like partnering with public television and independent media organizations to develop long-form documentary-style programming. Lower budget than what you're used to, smaller audiences, initially, but complete creative control and editorial independence. The goal would be proving that audiences are ready for more substantial political content. Victoria thought about Diana Foster, about the stories she had shared, about the children whose lives had been transformed when someone took the time to understand their individual circumstances rather than measuring them against standardized expectations. And if I choose to stay with the current show, you'd continue to be one of the most successful hosts in cable news, with all the financial security and professional recognition that comes with that status. But you'd also have to pretend that last night didn't happen, that you didn't discover something important about what journalism could be at its best. Victoria realized that the choice Marcus was presenting wasn't really about career paths or programming formats. It was about whether she had the courage to align her professional work with her personal values, even if it meant sacrificing some of the external markers of success she had spent years accumulating. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you think I'm being naive? Do you think I'm romanticizing one good interview and ignoring the reality of how media organizations actually function? Do you think I'm about to make a huge mistake based on idealistic assumptions about audience appetite for serious content? Marcus was quiet for a long time, and Victoria could hear him considering the question seriously rather than rushing to reassurance or judgment. I think you're being naive about some things and realistic about others. You're probably underestimating how difficult it will be to build sustainable programming around the approach you demonstrated last night. You're definitely underestimating the financial and logistical challenges of independent media production. Victoria felt her anxiety increasing, but she also appreciated Marcus's honesty. But, he continued, I think you're being completely realistic about what audiences actually want from political media. The response to last night's interview suggests that people are desperate for authentic content, for conversations that treat complex issues with the depth they deserve, for media that serves democratic values rather than just commercial interests. Victoria stood and walked back to the window, watching early morning traffic beginning to build on the streets below. Marcus, what would you do if you were in my position? I'd probably make the same choice you're about to make, even though it scares me, and even though I can't guarantee it will work out. Which choice is that? The choice to bet everything on the possibility that journalism can be both meaningful and successful, that audiences are more intelligent and curious than most media organizations assume, that there's room in this industry for work that prioritizes public service over pure profit. Victoria felt something settling in her chest, a sense of clarity that had been building since the moment Diana Foster first smiled at her across the interview table. Marcus, I think I want to do this. I think I want to leave cable television and try to build something better. I think I want to spend my career talking to people who are doing important work rather than people who are just famous or controversial. Are you sure? No, Victoria said with a laugh. I'm absolutely terrified, but I'm also more excited about my work than I've been in years, and I think that combination probably means I'm making the right choice for the right reasons. Victoria spent the rest of the morning making phone calls, not to agents or network executives, but to the journalism professors, foundation program officers, and independent media producers who had reached out in response to the previous night's interview. Each conversation reinforced her sense that there was genuine appetite for the kind of programming she wanted to develop, but also helped her understand the enormous challenges involved in building sustainable alternatives to commercial television. By noon, Victoria had committed to leaving Channel 7 News and partnering with a consortium of public media organizations to develop what would become Conversations That Matter, a weekly program featuring hour-long interviews with people whose work addressed significant social challenges. The format would be simple. No panels, no debates, no artificial conflict, just Victoria and one guest exploring complex issues through personal experience and professional expertise. The financial terms were far less attractive than her cable television contract, but the creative control was complete. Victoria would choose every guest, develop every question, and maintain editorial independence from commercial pressures. The program would be distributed through public television, podcast platforms, and streaming services, with the goal of reaching audiences who were hungry for substantial content, regardless of where they consumed media. Victoria's first guest would be a pediatric nurse who had developed innovative approaches to supporting families dealing with childhood chronic illness, not because the nurse was famous, but because her work mattered. Not because she was controversial, but because she had insights that could help other people facing similar challenges. Not because she would generate viral moments, but because her story deserved to be heard by people who cared about healthcare, family support, and human resilience. As Victoria prepared for this new chapter of her career, she found herself thinking, again, about Diana Foster and the conversation that had changed everything. Diana had reminded her that every professional field was populated by individuals who had chosen to prioritize service over self-advancement, who had found ways to create meaning within imperfect systems, who had maintained hope and commitment even when institutional incentives rewarded other priorities. Victoria realized that her own field, journalism, was full of such people. Reporters who chose to cover local government rather than celebrity scandals. Editors who prioritized accuracy over speed. Producers who supported substantial stories, even when they were more expensive and time-consuming than lighter content. Media organizations that served specific communities rather than chasing national attention. These were the journalists Victoria wanted to emulate, the media professionals who had maintained their commitment to democratic ideals and public service regardless of commercial pressures. They had been doing meaningful work all along, often without recognition or substantial compensation, while Victoria had been chasing ratings and building her personal brand. But it wasn't too late to change direction, to use her platform and her influence to support the kind of journalism that served citizens rather than just consumers. It wasn't too late to prioritize truth-telling over entertainment, understanding over conflict, solutions over problems. Victoria Sterling had spent 20 years becoming one of the most successful interviewers in cable television. Now she was ready to spend whatever time remained in her career becoming the kind of journalist she had originally hoped to be. Someone who used media to serve democratic values and human dignity rather than commercial interests and personal advancement. The transformation had begun with a single question about education policy and a government official who refused to play the usual political games. But Victoria understood that the real change was just beginning in her own approach to professional work and in her commitment to proving that audiences were ready for media that trusted their intelligence, respected their time, and served their genuine interests as citizens rather than just their appetite for entertainment. Victoria Sterling was about to discover whether journalism could be both meaningful and sustainable in an industry built around very different priorities. But for the first time in years, she was excited to find out. 6 months after Victoria Sterling walked away from cable television, she received an envelope that would validate every risk she had taken in transforming her career. The letter was handwritten, postmarked from a small town in rural Georgia, and addressed simply to the lady who interviews people who care. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing next to a science fair display about renewable energy. The girl was grinning broadly, holding a blue ribbon, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering something wonderful about the world. Below the photograph, in careful cursive handwriting, was a note that made Victoria's hands tremble as she read it. "Ms. Sterling, my name is Ashley Martinez. My teacher showed our class your interview with Dr. Peterson about kids and science education. Dr. Peterson said something that changed my whole life. She said every child is a natural scientist. We just have to give them permission to ask questions and explore answers. I never thought I was smart enough for science before, but now I won. First place in our county science fair, and I want to study marine biology when I grow up. Thank you for helping me believe in myself. Mumadi." Victoria sat in her small home office, surrounded by research materials for her upcoming interview with a community organizer who was transforming vacant lots into urban gardens, and felt the profound satisfaction that comes from work aligned with purpose. Conversations that matter had evolved far beyond her original vision, becoming something more intimate and more powerful than she had dared to imagine. The program's format remained simple, but its impact had grown exponentially. Through the stories of guests who were solving problems in their communities without seeking recognition or celebrity. Victoria had interviewed the founder of a program that taught financial literacy to high school students, a retired engineer who was building playgrounds in underserved neighborhoods, a former gang member who had become a counselor for at-risk youth, and dozens of other individuals whose work created ripple effects of positive change. Each episode generated letters like Ashley's, evidence that authentic storytelling about meaningful work inspired people to see new possibilities in their own lives and communities. Victoria's audience was smaller than what she had commanded in cable television, but it was more engaged, more diverse, and more likely to take action based on what they learned from the program. The financial challenges had been significant. Victoria's income was a fraction of what she had earned as a cable news host, and the production team consisted of Marcus and 2 part-time researchers working out of Victoria's apartment. But the creative freedom was complete, and the sense of purpose was profound. Every interview was conducted with genuine curiosity rather than strategic calculation. Every question was designed to illuminate rather than entrap. Every conversation was structured to serve audiences rather than advertisers. The program had also attracted attention from journalism schools and media organizations interested in alternative approaches to political content. Victoria found herself speaking at conferences, consulting with public television stations, and mentoring young journalists who wanted to prioritize substance over spectacle in their own careers. She had become an inadvertent advocate for media that served democratic values, though she always insisted that the real heroes were the guests who shared their stories and their insights. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her reflection on Ashley's letter. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local, so she answered. "Ms. Sterling, this is Janet Walsh from the New York Foundation for Educational Innovation. I'm calling because we've been following your work on conversations that matter, and we have a proposition that might interest you." Victoria leaned back in her chair, curious about what kind of proposition an educational foundation might have for a journalist who had deliberately stepped away from mainstream media. "I'm listening. We're launching a national initiative to support community-based solutions to educational challenges, and we'd like to partner with you to document and share stories from the initiative. The goal would be creating a multimedia series that showcases innovative approaches to learning and teaching, especially in communities that have been historically underserved by traditional educational systems." Victoria felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had hoped would emerge from her commitment to meaningful journalism, a chance to use media to support positive change rather than just analyze problems. Can you tell me more about the initiative? We're providing grants to community organizations, parent groups, and educator collaboratives who are developing creative solutions to specific educational challenges in their areas. The recipients include a group in Detroit that's turning abandoned buildings into makerspaces, a coalition in rural Montana that's connecting students with scientists through virtual reality, and a network in South Texas that's integrating traditional, ecological knowledge into STEM curricula. Victoria found herself taking notes, not for television production, but because the work Janet was describing sounded like exactly the kind of stories she wanted to tell. What would the partnership look like? We'd like you to visit each grant recipient, interview the people involved, and create content that helps other communities understand how these innovations work and how they might be adapted to different contexts. The format would be entirely up to you, but the goal would be creating resources that inspire and inform rather than just entertain. Victoria thought about Diana Foster, about the conversation that had started this transformation in her career, about the principle that meaningful work deserved to be seen and understood and replicated when possible. Janet, I'm very interested in this partnership. Can we set up a time to discuss the details? 3 weeks later, Victoria found herself on a plane to Detroit, preparing for the first interview in what would become her most ambitious project yet. The Detroit Urban Learning Collaborative had transformed a former automotive factory into a community learning center, where young people worked with local artists, engineers, and entrepreneurs to develop solutions to neighborhood challenges. Victoria's host was Dr. Maria Santos, a former public school principal who had left the formal education system to create something entirely new. Dr. Santos met Victoria at the airport with an energy and enthusiasm that reminded her immediately of Diana Foster, the same combination of practical experience and visionary thinking that characterized educators who refused to accept that systemic failures were inevitable. Miss Sterling, I can't tell you how excited we are about this visit. Your interview with Secretary Foster inspired so many of us who are working outside traditional systems. She articulated something we've all been feeling but couldn't quite put into words, that education has to start with seeing children as complete human beings rather than problems to be solved or products to be manufactured. The drive through Detroit took them past blocks of abandoned buildings interspersed with vibrant community gardens, new businesses, and art installations. Dr. Santos provided commentary that helped Victoria understand how the city's economic challenges had created space for innovative approaches to everything from urban agriculture to alternative education. The beautiful thing about working in a place that's been written off by traditional institutions, Dr. Santos explained, is that you have freedom to try things that would never be approved in more conventional settings. When the old systems don't work, you get permission to build new ones. The Urban Learning Collaborative occupied a massive brick building that had once housed an assembly line. Inside, Victoria discovered a space that defied every assumption about what educational environments should look like. Instead of classrooms arranged in rows, there were workshop areas where teenagers were building robots, art studios where children were creating murals that told the history of their neighborhood, gardens where students were growing food that would be distributed to local families, and meeting spaces where young people were presenting business plans to actual entrepreneurs. Victoria spent 3 days at the collaborative, interviewing students, teachers, parents, and community partners. Each conversation revealed another layer of intentionality behind what might have appeared to be chaotic creativity. The program was structured around project-based learning that connected academic skills to real community needs. Students weren't just studying math, they were using mathematical concepts to design efficient distribution systems for the food bank. They weren't just learning about history, they were documenting oral histories from neighborhood elders and creating digital archives that preserved community knowledge. But what struck Victoria most powerfully was the relationship between educators and students. There was none of the hierarchical distance that characterized traditional classrooms. Teachers were facilitators and collaborators, adults who brought expertise to shared projects rather than authority figures dispensing predetermined curricula. Students were treated as capable contributors whose ideas and perspectives were valued rather than deficits to be remediated. Victoria's interview with Dr. Santos took place in the building's rooftop garden, overlooking a neighborhood that showed signs of both struggle and renewal. The conversation felt like a continuation of her discussion with Diana Foster, an exploration of what education could become when it was freed from the constraints of standardized thinking. Dr. Santos, when people look at what you've created, here they see something that looks very different from traditional schools. How do you respond to critics who argue that this kind of approach can't be scaled or replicated in other contexts? Dr. Santos smiled with the same confidence Victoria had seen in Diana Foster, the assurance of someone who had tested their theories through practice and seen the results. I tell them they're asking the wrong question. They're assuming that scaling means creating identical programs everywhere, but that misses the whole point of community-based education. The goal isn't to replicate our specific model, it's to replicate our principles and our process. Dr. Santos gestured toward the garden around them, where students were tending plants that would feed their families and neighbors. Every community has different assets, different challenges, different cultural resources. What we've done here works because it's rooted in the specific history and needs of this neighborhood. But the principles behind our work, listening to young people, connecting learning to community needs, treating education as a collaborative process rather than a delivery system, those principles can be adapted anywhere. Victoria found herself thinking about Ashley Martinez, the young girl who had written to her about discovering her love of science. Ashley's transformation hadn't required a complete overhaul of her school system. It had required one teacher who believed in her potential and one interview that helped her see herself differently. Can you give me an example of how these principles might work in a very different context? Absolutely. We've been working with educators in rural communities who are facing completely different challenges than what we deal with in Detroit. Instead of abandoned buildings, they're working with agricultural landscapes. Instead of urban artists, they're connecting with farmers and ranchers. But they're using the same approach, starting with community assets, involving young people, as partners in addressing local challenges and measuring success by real-world impact rather than standardized test scores. Victoria spent her final day in Detroit interviewing students who had been part of the collaborative for multiple years. Their stories reinforced everything Dr. Santos had shared about the power of education that honored young people's intelligence and connected their learning to meaningful work. Keisha, a 17-year-old who was planning to study environmental engineering, explained how working on water quality testing in her neighborhood had convinced her that science could be a tool for social justice. Marcus, a 15-year-old who had struggled in traditional classrooms, described how collaborating with local entrepreneurs on business plans had revealed his talent for strategic thinking and financial analysis. Destiny, a 16-year-old artist, talked about how documenting community oral histories had connected her to her own cultural heritage while developing her skills in digital media production. Each student's story was unique, but they shared common themes: the importance of being seen as capable and creative, the power of connecting academic learning to real community needs, and the transformational impact of working alongside adults who treated them as partners rather than subordinates. Victoria left Detroit with dozens of hours of interviews and a profound sense of optimism about the future of education. The Urban Learning Collaborative was proof that alternatives to traditional schooling could produce remarkable results when they were designed around principles of respect, collaboration, and community engagement. But more importantly, for Victoria's own work, the visit had demonstrated the power of storytelling to create connections between innovative local work and broader audiences who might be inspired to pursue similar approaches in their own communities. The Educational Foundation had been right. Documenting and sharing these stories could accelerate positive change by helping people see what was possible and understand how they might contribute to transformation in their own contexts. Victoria's series about community-based educational innovations aired over the course of 6 months, featuring the Detroit Collaborative alongside programs in Montana, Texas, Alaska, and North Carolina. Each episode explored different approaches to the same fundamental challenge: how to create learning environments that served all students rather than just those who succeeded in traditional academic settings. The response was unprecedented for Victoria's program. Educators, parents, policymakers, and community leaders from across the country reached out with questions about how they might implement similar approaches in their own areas. The New York Foundation for Educational Innovation reported that their website traffic increased by 400% during the series, with particular interest in resources for starting community-based learning initiatives. But the most meaningful response came in the form of action. Within a year of the series' completion, Victoria had documented the launch of 17 new community learning initiatives that had been directly inspired by the stories she had shared. Each program was adapted to local circumstances and resources, but all were guided by the principles of student voice, community partnership, and real-world application that characterized the most successful innovative education programs. Victoria realized that her career transformation had come full circle. She had started by discovering the power of authentic journalism to create understanding across difference. She had continued by building a platform for meaningful conversations about important work. And now she was witnessing the ultimate validation of purpose-driven media. Stories that inspired people to take action in their own communities, creating ripple effects of positive change that extended far beyond any single interview or episode. The letter from Ashley Martinez remained pinned to the wall above Victoria's desk, a daily reminder that every conversation mattered, every story had the potential to change someone's life, and every choice to prioritize meaning over profit created space for others to do the same. Victoria Sterling had discovered that the most successful career was not necessarily the most famous or lucrative, but the one that aligned professional skills with personal values and contributed to the kind of world she wanted to live in. Diana Foster had been right about the power of seeing every individual as a complete human being with unlimited potential. That principle applied not just to children in schools, but to guests on interview programs, audiences consuming media, content, and journalists trying to serve democratic ideals in an industry built around very different priorities. When people were treated with respect and genuine curiosity, when their stories were told with authenticity and care, when their work was presented as meaningful rather than just entertaining, remarkable things became possible. Victoria Sterling had learned that changing careers was less important than changing how she approached the career she already had. The transformation that began with a single interview about education policy had evolved into a new understanding of journalism's potential to serve human dignity and democratic values. Every conversation was an opportunity to create understanding, Every story was a chance to inspire positive action, and every choice to prioritize authenticity over artifice made space for others to do meaningful work in their own fields. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.